if people had specific insect issues, especially in grain crops. I work in grain crops this year because unlike in previous years in Pennsylvania, we had some particular problems. So I'm going to share my screen, and if I don't know if I'll be able to see the chat.
Yeah, I'll make sure I'll make sure I tell you, Mary, if there's.
All right, awesome. So I will start that. So this is actually the end of my presentation today. As Erin said, I'm an entomologist. I've been at Penn State since 2002, and during that entire time, I've focused on pest management in organic systems. And so I just wanted to start out with some slides on some particular pests that we had issues with this year. So I've been working in these organic systems for about 20 years. And for most of that time, except for just a few minor exceptions, we have not really in our field crops, in our corn, especially soybean, small grains, we haven't really had any serious insect pest problems. And that always kind of surprised me. But so what I've done, instead of focusing on pests, I've for 20 years focused on biological control, mostly generalist natural enemies and also insect pathogens. But this past year, it was really buggy and it caught me off guard. And especially the problems we had this year were seed corn maggot, fall armyworm, and western bean cutworm. So I definitely, because Erin mentioned fall armyworm, I did want to talk about what happened with fall armyworm this year. And hopefully it won't be a continuing trend. So fall armyworm, it is native to Central America, South America, and the southern United States. It's a tropical species, and they're usually endemic in warmer areas where they have several generations per year. They overwinter and they breed in Texas and Florida in the US. And then in the spring, so the populations build up down in Texas and Florida and the southeastern United States. They get blown up here with storms and wind. And when that happens, it really coincides with as corn is being planted as you move north from south upwards. And so that it's considered a late season pest because by the time it gets up here, it is later in the season, as opposed to down in the south, it's like pretty much a year-round pest. So the moths get blown up on these weather fronts, and then they lay eggs, and the eggs hatch about a week later. And you probably don't even notice it in corn because the small larvae don't do a lot of damage. And it's not until those larvae develop into larger stages, when they really eat a lot, that you start to notice the damage from them. And by then, even in conventional systems, it can be too late really to do anything. Because it is this tropical pest, some of the moths then in the fall return south, but mostly those larvae that are still around in pupae, and even the moths, they can't take the low temperatures below about 40 degrees or so, definitely not freezing, and they're killed by frost. And so because of that, just because you have a problem in one year for this particular insect does not doom you to having a problem in subsequent years, so that's good. So what happened in 2021, there was a warm winter across the South, and so those larvae in the pupating moths or insect, they were not killed at a high rate down there. So a lot of moths survived. And then, so there were really good conditions to build up large populations of fall armyworm in the south. And then there were a lot of tropical storms last year. There were 20 named storms. And in addition, because of these tropical storms, even where people did have, conventional growers did have spray programs in the south, because there was a lot of rain that could lead to potential spray failures. And because there was rain, there was a good, healthy, lush crop as they were being blown north for them to survive. So, so that is why last year, I don't know if in your region, but in our region, fall armyworm was a big problem. And so if weather patterns are changing and this continues, we can expect to have fall armyworm in future years. But if this was just sort of a cyclical weather pattern and not really climate change related, then it will just depend on the particular conditions in the south. So that's what happened with fall armyworm. So again, those moths arrive from the south in the mid to late summer. The moths mate and lay eggs. And then there are these 7 larval stages. They start out very, very small. They go through their development, and you may have seen them. They're recognizable by this sort of Y-shaped marking on their head. And in the north, probably in your region, in our region, and farther north, they may not even finish a whole generation by the time they get here, but they can still do plenty of damage as these large larvae. But there may not be enough growing degree days left for them to finish their development and lay more eggs, which would be killed anyway by frost. But usually you see that damage late in the summer, early fall, and it looks, you know, like very ragged. The moths really like to lay eggs in the whorl when they first attack. And so when the whorl unfurls, you get these, looks like rows of holes. And then as the larvae feed, they even get more ragged. And the frass looks a little bit like sawdust. And those large larvae start making a big mess. It's kind of moister and wetter. And then they can also get into the ear. So when they get into the ear, these larger larvae are cannibalistic, so you usually only find 1 larva per ear, as opposed to some other pests that we have. But a lot of these cutworms and armyworms, they are cannibalistic, and so that's why you only get one worm per ear in corn. And as they destroy a crop, they have a huge host range. Like 350 plant species. So it's really hard to choose crops that they are not, that wouldn't necessarily suffer damage from those, all of the field crops. And they especially like grasses and grassy weeds. So because of when you start seeing the damage, they're really difficult to control, even in conventional systems. There are pheromone traps that are available that you can monitor for flights of the moths to sort of, there's not really a lot you can do about it except know that they're going to be a problem. There are pest reports that you can watch, that you can sign up for. Those eggs are on the foliage, and there are allowable materials or registered materials for organic systems, whether it's economic or not, to treat a field crop. I can't really say. I suspect no. But on higher value crops, sweet corn or vegetables, it probably is, if you have a heavy infestation. The thing is you have to treat the larvae when they're tiny, when they're just really in those really early instars. So you have to be monitoring for egg masses or using pheromone traps to see when those flights are. Because once they're in the ear or once they're larger, these materials are not effective. They do have a lot of natural enemies and diseases that cause a lot of mortality. So it just depends on, there are probably always some fall armyworm around, not at the level that we had, but usually they're kept under levels that aren't economically damaging by natural enemies and diseases. They have parasitoid wasps. There are a lot of predatory insects that get them. They get a viral disease that's can knock them out. And again, the frost will kill them. This was is an example. So weed control is pretty important, especially grassy weeds. This is from a study where they compared the development of fall armyworm on different weeds compared to on corn. And these grassy weeds, Johnson grass and goosegrass, which is related to crabgrass, the development was not different from on, and survival was not different than on corn. So they're very happy on some of these grassy weeds. There was a little bit less survival on pigweed and Bengal dayflower. You guys might not have it up there. That's a more tropical or subtropical weed. And fleabane is related to mare's tail, and the survival was very poor on that. So weed management can be a pretty important control measure for fall armyworm too. Okay, so again, they have a lot of natural enemies. All these generalist natural enemies will eat the eggs and small larvae. The later stage larvae and what are called the pre-pupae, before the armyworm pupates and goes to the soil. Birds and raccoons, skunks will eat those, especially out of the soil, but those can also, actually those mammals can be damaging in a crop. They dig them up in the soil. And then again, they get a lot of diseases from viruses, fungi, protozoa, bacteria, insect parasitic nematodes. Okay, so I'm going to skip back now, except I do want to just talk about, if you don't want to monitor these things with pheromones yourself, there are web reports that you can follow that will report on the numbers of these insect pests that come in, especially these more migratory ones like fall armyworm. This is a site for Wisconsin. And then there's a site called Insect Forecast. It is industry-based, but it has really great information on following particular insect pests and you can predict when these pests are going to show up in your area. And this particular site, Insect Forecast, follows black cutworm, corn earworm, corn rootworm, soybean aphid, and western bean cutworm. And so it has an insect tracker and it has maps, and I'll show you an example of the map, and it sends alerts and migration maps. And if you don't want to do all that, you can do it more, it's a more difficult way. If you know when they show up, there are also information on how many growing degree days are necessary for the development of these insect pests, so you can predict when they're going to be damaging. And there's a growing degree day calculator from out of Cornell. It's actually very useful. You can plug in your location and the date, and it will tell you how many growing degree days have elapsed or accumulated in your area. Okay, so this is from that Insect Forecast website, and it's actually pretty slick. It will give you a risk report based on your location and the particular insect that you're wanting to track. And currently, it's these 5 insects. And this one is for western bean cutworm, which is endemic in most areas now. It was originally, before 2000, in the Great Plains, and then it has spread throughout this northern tier and mid-Atlantic. So this is an insect that you can track at this site. And what happens is for a particular date, you can plug in a date and it will tell you your risk level. It shows sort of a map of where there are outbreak conditions, and they have a color-coded map system. So here, this yellow was more intense infestation than in this area with the green. So that it's kind of fun to play around with this site if you like to be on the computer and play with these sort of things. To look at what happened, you could see what happened last year at this point. Nothing's happening right now. Okay, so now I'm going to escape and go back to my general.
So there are some questions, Mary.
Oh,
about
okay,
these.
sure.
So, and this is one that I remember getting some emails or seeing on the listserv, wireworms. So I don't know if you can talk more. I think I may have asked you about wireworms because you're my go-to person.
Yeah,
what about a
wireworms.
rotation impacts wireworms, or is there are there management, when do they show up? Are there management strategies?
So wireworms are difficult because there are different species of wireworm and they have different lengths of development time. So some can be wireworms, they're click beetles. Some can be worms in the soil feeding on your corn roots or whatever for 1 year, some 3, some 7. So I think you need to work with extension and kind of figure out what species you have. You can bait early in the season to see if you have a wireworm problem. And apparently one wireworm per bait is considered economic. So the way you do that is you soak corn or small grain until it's sort of soaked up water. And then you put that in like a container, or you can just bury it and you dig a hole in your field where you're going to plant before planting. And you bury that, and then you come back. That ferments a little bit in the soil and germinates, and it's very attractive to the wireworms in the soil. And you can come back and dig that up before you plant again. So you might do it like 3 or 4 weeks before you're planning to plant. And then you can leave it down there a week or 2 weeks and then dig it up. And if it has wireworms in it, you have a problem. Usually wireworms are a problem in heavier soils or where you have turned in sod. If you've had like maybe a mixed grass alfalfa field, I don't know how common that is where you are, or a sod, a hay field, a pasture in your rotation. A lot of organic growers here have mixed hay in their rotation to build up soil organic matter and nitrogen for a following corn crop. That situation is actually pretty attractive to a lot of insects, unfortunately. And so you really need to let that stuff decompose well before you plant. But at that and rotation again is tricky because some of those wireworms have a wide host range and some of them have very long periods of time that they live in the soil. So a long rotation, which is hard, I know, especially if you're growing corn for feed in your own situation, or if you're growing corn for sales. So I probably didn't do a good job of it, not a hopeful job in organic systems. But the thing is they usually are sporadic in space and time, and you may be able to, if you have fields that are particularly troublesome, you might have to go out of a particular crop for a while.
So Chris Wilson put in the chat, he's not too far from Madison, a dairy farm, that they have wireworm problems following alfalfa grass mix. Manure applied.
Right, manure.
It makes
lots of organic matter. Those high organic matter, it's great for soil health, but there are some particular insects that also favors. And so, right, so wireworms are one of those, and that's the case where you say, well, if I do have this particular problem, again, I'm going to have to rotate out of that. And if you're on a dairy farm, I mean, there's not a good solution for that.
He's asking too, does fall or spring tillage impact the wireworms at all?
That I don't know. I could look that up and send that to you. Certainly, like if you, it will be worse for several insects that are attracted to decomposing organic matter if you're doing that in the spring. The issue is if you do it in the fall, then you have that exposed soil all winter, which is also not great. But if you have a particular insect problem and you're going to manage for that insect problem, then I would guess that the fall tillage, early fall tillage would be more disruptive to their, and the earlier the tillage, right? So we find fewer problems with insects. So that if you have a small grain in the rotation, that's really useful because it makes your tillage at a very different time than in the fall. So if you can rotate with small grains, sometimes that's helpful too. Then you have a sort of a mid-season, July, August tillage, and you might follow that with a cover crop that you then turn in the spring and let that decompose well.
He and Kyle both said that they've both gone to higher seeding rates for corn to offset the loss in population. And Kyle mentioned too that that their agronomist thinks the wireworms are following a hog manure application.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we don't really have hog manure here. So that's interesting. We're using either a dry poultry manure, poultry litter, or dairy manure, or a little bit of bedded pack, but mostly liquid dairy manure in this area. And
can you talk a little bit about spring armyworms and how cover crop management, especially a green manure cover crop, might impact armyworm populations?
Yeah, true armyworm.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one that unfortunately they lay their eggs on green stuff early in the season. So that's before your crop. And then when you manage those cover crops, if there is germinating corn around, that's when they're going to show up. They're going to move onto the corn. So again, what we've been doing, you know, been working a lot with rolled cover crops. And then as those dry down and are dead, then we're planting into rolled. I know you're doing something a little bit different up there, going into living cover crops. But we find that planting into that rolled mat, it really, the natural enemy populations, the ground beetles, really build up in that mat of rolled cover crops. So even when we've had true armyworm around, we haven't had a tremendous amount of damage when we no-till plant into that rolled mat of cover crops. But they're another one, yeah, they'll move on from green. And another thing about those pests, they're really difficult. We monitor with pheromone traps just because they're highly mobile. So unfortunately, you could be doing really great practices to suppress them, but with these highly mobile pests like fall armyworm, western bean cutworm, true armyworm, they are going to fly in from anywhere, right? So somebody next to you might not be doing a good job of managing, but.
So I know with spring or seed corn maggot, we've recommended, although there is a model available.
There's a model, yeah.
But more generally, we recommend to wait about 2.5 weeks past cover crop termination. Kyle also, oh, go ahead, Mary.
Well, another thing you want to do is you really want to wait to plant. And I know this is really hard. I mean, you have to plant when you have to plant, right? But if you can wait until the soil is really warmed up enough to get that, especially corn, to like really germinate quickly, Like if you have good planting conditions, good soil moisture, warm conditions, what you want to do is a lot of that damage, it's really when the plants are germinating and when they're seedlings that they're really vulnerable. So you want to get that seed to germinate and up out of the ground, and more than a few inches high as quickly as possible. So the weighting on the corn, the seed corn maggot, yeah, that seed corn maggot, there is a model that you calculate growing degree days so that you hit the period when the maggots become pupae, and so they're not feeding. And so you want your corn to really get up and out of the ground fast during that time when they're pupae in the soil. And then the flies come up, and usually the later generations of seed corn maggot aren't a problem, but they are attracted to the decomposing organic matter if you're using tillage.
And we use that model to plan our plantings at the research
Yeah,
station.
yeah, because we have gotten caught by that too. But yeah, that's always tricky. It just depends if you're expecting a problem, because so often, if especially here, we've had some really wet springs, and it's like, well, when the soil's ready, we just have to go, whether, the timing is perfect for seed corn maggot or not. Luckily, we haven't usually suffered much loss from that, but the higher seeding rates is also for most of these early spring pests is a good idea.
Are there any tricks about cover crop management and cutworms? Kyle mentioned that several years ago. He had bad cutworm in half the field, and the half that was bad with cutworms had an overwintered rye cover crop that was worked in, and the other half with no cover crop was fine.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, they can be where there's a lot of surface residue, and that's something you can time too. We also do pheromone trapping for black cutworm. And you can hit that, it's similar to true armyworm. The moths are around, they lay in their eggs in the cover crops and on weeds. And so pheromone trapping, you have to learn how, you use a specific pheromone with the pheromone traps, and then you can see when the flights are happening. And if you have heavy flights, you'll know that there are those egg laying adults that can move off of your cover crops. But yeah, I know some growers around here have had that problem where they've done rolled cover crops and they've planted at a time when their plants are just germinating, and it hit that flight at just the wrong time. So a lot of this is like based on monitoring, really knowing what pests expect. And a lot of times these things are reported. Like I said, you can follow particular websites and they will report if you have a monitoring system in the state. We have one here where educators report flights of these insects so that people can try to avoid their plants being at a susceptible stage when those flights are happening.
So there's a couple of storage questions. I don't know if you're comfortable answering storage questions about flower beetles in storage. Is there a effective cold storage temperature to kill the beetles, and weevils?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of information. I do have an extension bulletin on that, but I wrote it a few years ago. A lot of it is sanitation. And if you have a large facility, sort of the mixing, but definitely sanitation is super important, and cleaning like under the floors and everything to get rid of those, and to have really a tight system. Some insects, it depends if they feed in the grain, if the eggs are laid like on the grain and the larvae are always in the grain. I can't remember which ones. But those ones are hard to kill with DE. Some insects like the Indian meal moth, you can have DE, diatomaceous earth on the surface, on the top of your grain in storage, and that will help. And it's some of those insects also are just in the top few inches or several inches, and that can be removed. So
I put the link to your bulletin in the chat. We had it on our website. So
okay, good. Thanks. Yeah,
so,
that's not my area, but we had some questions about that, so I pulled that together a couple years ago.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, if anyone needs a PDF copy, just email me and let me know. I'm happy to send a PDF copy to folks. I think that's all the questions for now, Mary. So you can go on with.
All right. So yeah, so I just wanted to talk then about a general approach, you know, kind of good practices for insect pest management. And there are always, I shouldn't say always, because we didn't have any for like 20 years till last year. And I don't know why that is, if it's just our geographic area or we use good rotations. We have a lot of diversity in our rotations. But so I like to approach pest management as part of soil health. And so, you know, you guys have probably all been to lots of soil health webinars and sessions and know a lot about that soil health is an integration of the physical, chemical, and biological. And I like to really focus on the biological. The idea is if you can get a healthy crop, it's competitive with weeds, and it's also less attractive to insect pests. And if you do have pests of most kind, which are usually in the environment, but they're not causing an economic level of damage, is those healthy plants are more tolerant to insect damage and disease. And so really the focus is on like, how do I know if I have healthy soil, and how do I manage for that? And you probably have expert growers at that, I know. So I'm sorry if I'm being really redundant, but you know, there's a lot of ways and tests for soil health, but really I think one of the most important things to measure is soil organic matter. If you have soil tests done, because good soil organic matter, you have good nutrient retention, good soil fertility, usually the structure is pretty good, and the aggregate stability or the soil stability is good. You can look for particular organisms, earthworms. You can measure on your own decomposition rate. You know how fast your residues are decomposed. If they sort of disappear pretty quickly, it means your soil is probably pretty biologically active. You know, there's this funny soil your undies. You can bury some cotton underwear and see how fast they disappear. And all those things are indicators. You can buy tests, but soil respiration, I think it's just the easiest is to really follow your soil organic matter and looking at how quickly your residues are decomposed. And certain organisms are sort of indicators like earthworms, but not everybody has earthworms, and I don't like people to freak out if they don't. You can spend a lot of money sending your soil off to, and it's interesting if you like to follow that sort of thing. Okay, so you know there's a ton of, more than tons, 8 cows worth per acre of organisms in your soil, like contributing hopefully to your soil health. Most of them are beneficial or neutral for us, or a minority of them are pest organisms. Of course, those are the ones we like to focus on when we have a problem. Most of those organisms are microorganisms. We can't really see them. Things like bacteria, fungi, algae, protozoa. And then we have the small animals. Again, those are usually, you might be able to see them with your naked eye if you have good eyesight and you have high populations, or if you dig through a compost pile, you will see these things because they're more numerous. The microfauna, or the microscopic sized animals, things like nematodes, springtails, and mites. And then you have the larger organisms that you can see, the macrofauna, or the large animals, things like the earthworms and beetle larvae, spiders, those sort of organisms. So the microorganisms in soil can be really important for pest management because a lot of them infect, compete with, or antagonize pest organisms, both plant disease causing organisms and insects. They contribute to the decomposition or the destruction of weed seeds. Of course, they're very important in nutrient cycling, breaking down that organic matter and converting it from a type of nutrients that are bound up in organic matter, organic form, to an inorganic form. That's called mineralization. That's a plant available form of nutrients, help plant grow. They contribute to your soil stability, and they also some of them produce substances that can stimulate plant growth, and specific ones that contribute to plant nutrition and increase plant health, and also tolerance or resistance to pests like Mycorrhizae. And Mycorrhizae are especially, I think, interesting. You know, Mycorrhizae are those symbiotic fungi that grow into plant roots, most species except for plants in the buckwheat family and brassicas. And they form the symbiosis with plant roots, and their hyphae grow out into soil, and they really kind of knit your soil together in the rhizosphere. So they're really important for stabilizing soil and enhancing aggregate stability. They also produce a lot of polysaccharide. It's like a gluey material that they exude. In these pictures, it's been dyed so that you can see it. It's called glomalin. And it kind of glues soil together, and it represents a lot of carbon in the soil. So mycorrhizae are really interesting. I'm sure you guys know a lot about mycorrhizae and their contribution to plant nutrition, in that they can mine especially phosphorus and extend that root biomass by acting like roots as the hyphae grow out into the soil. Another kind of microorganism that's in the soil that we know less about, but is really interesting, and we're learning more about it, is called the endophytic insect pathogenic fungi. So there are fungi in the soil that infect insects, and these are some pictures of some of the kind that are common in agricultural soils that we find. And about 10 years ago, it was discovered that some of these fungi, in addition to killing insects in the soil, can also grow into plant roots. And when they grow into plant roots, similar to mycorrhizae, they promote plant growth, and they can also suppress insect feeding. And those effects are probably indirect. It's not the fungus itself that is suppressing the insects, it's their interaction with the plant. They turn on the plant's natural defensive system, the plant's immune system, and make the plant less attractive to insect feeding, and can suppress the growth of some insects that feed on those plants. Another really interesting thing that has been discovered about these particular fungi in soil is that if you have an insect that's been infected and killed by these fungi, hyphae can grow out and grow into roots, and the plant can obtain nitrogen then from those insect cadavers that are infected with the fungus, and in exchange, the fungus gets carbon, similar to mycorrhizal fungi, which protect, have benefits to the plant, but also get carbon from the plant in return. Okay, so how do these soil fungi affect insects? Well, so these insect pathogenic endophytes, those fungi that infect insects and can also grow in the plants, has been shown that they can reduce insect abundance, the reproductive rate of insects, larval survival, the weight of larvae. And when larvae don't have good weight, they don't make healthy adults, and they can decrease the amount of plant eaten. And that's similar in mycorrhizae. Sometimes there's no net effect of mycorrhizae on insects, but in general, they are beneficial in reducing insect damage or increasing the tolerance of plants to insects. So we really want to manage so that we can preserve these microorganisms in soil. And I'll get to that in a little bit. That next size class of organisms are the soil microfauna, or the small animals. And these are important in soil, to biological soil health, because they can control the rate of decomposition and mineralization, because they're feeding on those microbes that are the primary decomposers. And they also, when they're feeding in the soil, they're fragmenting organic matter, and it makes it easier for the primary decomposers to decompose those smaller fragments of organic matter than the big chunks of organic matter. It's similar to us. We like to cut up our food before we eat it. So these small animals are acting kind of like a knife and fork for the primary decomposers, which are bacteria and fungi. You know, as they're living and dying, they're eating and they're pooping, and their waste products contribute to to soil fertility and also to aggregate stability in the soil. They themselves can be predators or pathogens of insects. Like this nematode is a beneficial nematode that infects insects that lives in the soil. They also provide food for the larger organisms. So they all interact in the soil food web. And they can also transport organisms through the soil. As you can see, this particular mite it has its own little smaller mites, but they can have microbes on their surface. Okay, and so the larger ones, the larger animals that we're all more familiar with because we can see them, are called can be called ecosystem engineers, because unlike these small organisms, these organisms are not big enough and strong enough to make soil structure. They can't make new pores and channels. They're sort of stuck in those pores and channels that are there. And so these ecosystem engineers, they are actually big enough and strong enough to make pores and channels in the soil and help build that soil structure. It's really important. You want your soil to be porous, like a sponge, not like a brick. Okay, and so they're similar to those small animals. They're eating and they're creating waste products that add to the fertility of soil. A lot of them are predators, especially we have a lot of spiders in organic systems, ground beetles, tiger beetles, rove beetles that are all really important predators. Earwigs can be important predators, especially of things like western bean cutworm and fall armyworm. And they can transport organisms through the soil profile. We know that earthworms carry a lot of organisms through the soil, and they again are food for larger organisms that are beneficial in these systems. So sometimes I was just at a webinar the other day on soil health, and they were talking about earthworms, and I really like this. They are ambassadors for soil health because they stimulate. If you have earthworms, it usually means there's a lot of other beneficial organisms there too, because they stimulate the growth and activity of soil organisms, because they allow transport of organic matter and channels for air and water into the soil. And their channels are also enriched with nutrients. So earthworms, again, are good. There are much smaller worms called potworms or enchytraids that do a similar thing. They're just not so visible and their pores are smaller. But so if you don't have earthworms, you might have those other smaller ones that behave similarly in the soil. So what are these, when we're managing for these beneficial soil organisms and for healthy soil to grow healthy crops, what do they need? Well, they need everything like we do. They need, most of all, they need space in the soil. So soil structure is really important. It's really important to avoid compacting your soil because a lot of these organisms, they can't move. Like I said, they can't move soil. They're really restricted to those pores and channels that are there. And then they need water, air, and food. And the base of that soil food web is organic matter. And from there, the things that grow on organic matter, the other organisms are feeding on them. And so you do need organic matter as the base of that soil food web to keep your biological soil health going. And this is just my reminder again with this nematode that we need to avoid compaction to be able to have all these other things, resources available to soil organisms. And so there are principles that I didn't make up. The NRCS is promoting these 4 main principles of management for soil health, and they are good for soil biological health and for insect pest management. And the first is to provide continuous living roots, and roots are really leaky. You know, plants are converting sunlight and water and soil nutrients. They're producing a lot of carbon, sugars, which are transferred to the roots, and the roots are super leaky. And so by that leakiness of these nutrients and carbon containing compounds, that in the rhizosphere, that area around the root supports abundant biological life, especially microbial life. And plants, it turns out, can actually shape particular plants, species, shape the community of microbes around them so that there's a mutual benefit. And the interaction between these microbes and crops also changes the plant chemistry, and it can alter the plant chemistry and the volatile compounds, those sort of odors of plants that plants produce. And that can change the attractiveness of plants to both pest organisms and to natural enemies. And this environment, high nutrient, high carbon environment, also supports organisms like mycorrhizal fungi and encourages that association. And so those organisms in the rhizosphere can turn on the plant's immune system. For example, there are certain kinds of bacteria called plant growth promoting rhizobacteria, or PGPR, and these endophytic fungi, the fungi that can grow into plant roots, and also fungi and other organisms that grow on the outside of plant roots in the rhizosphere, and sometimes even root feeding. Your wireworms that you talked about, a little bit of root feeding, they stimulate the plant's immune system and cause a phenomenon of induced resistance. And so if a microorganism causes this induced resistance, it's called systemic acquired resistance. If an insect or other small animal, if their feeding causes that, it's called induced systemic resistance. But what happens is that association in the roots turns on the plant immune system, and it turns on the plant immune system in the whole plant. And that's why it's called systemic. And this is demonstrated to really, at least for some insects, make these plants less attractive to and more tolerant to feeding than plants where this immune system has not been turned on. Okay, so that's why it's important. Some of the reasons why it's important to always have living roots in the soil. So, for example, having cover crops in your rotation, or some perennial phases in your rotation. Another principle is to minimize disturbance. And in ag systems, our main causes of disturbance are physical through tillage and cultivation, and chemical. This is, we have a lot of potentially have a lot of beneficial organisms in organic systems, because in field cropping systems, at least, we don't use, if any, pesticides, even, allowable pesticides, because it's really not economical. And then fertilizers are another cause of chemical disturbance in conventional systems. And so where we reduce tillage, we expect to see an increase in predators, predatory insects and invertebrates, an increase in those decomposers that help nutrient cycling, and sort of not a huge effect on pests. Some pests are worse in reduced tillage systems. Some are, there are fewer in reduced systems, but by far there are definitely more natural enemies and earthworms where we can reduce tillage either through rotation or practicing some other, reduced tillage practice, like rolling cover crops and no-till planting into rolled cover crops. And in conventional tillage, where we have a really clean till system, we expect a reduction in the number of predators on the soil, a decrease in the number of decomposers that are involved in nutrient cycling. And again, some pests are adapted to these systems and some pests aren't. So the pest community tends to be a little bit different in those two extremes of that system. So pests that are more or less common with tillage are things like black cutworm, armyworm, and slugs, because these things like to feed, like black cutworm and armyworm and some of the other noctuid worms. They like to feed at night, and they're in the soil during the day. And so when we till, we're disrupting those stages that are usually in the soil during the day. More common with tillage, seed corn maggot. The flies are attracted to that decomposing organic matter when you turn in cover crops or other residue. Cornleaf aphid tends to be more common with tillage, if that's a problem that you have. There's a lot of insects, though, that aren't affected by tillage really at all. Corn rootworms, European corn borer, fall armyworm, corn earworm, western bean cutworm. So it's not going to matter if you till or not for some of these pests. Again, there are lots of natural enemies, both above ground and associated with the soil. The soil is a tremendous reservoir of predatory insects and also insect pathogens like nematodes and fungi. And we know that as you increase the number of disturbances, you decrease the number of soil-associated predators. We have done experiments with rolling cover crops and no-till planting into those rolled mat, and then comparing that with tilled systems. And we see that the more disturbance you have, the fewer predators you have in field crops and probably other crops too. And we know that that's important because these graphs show that the more predators that you have in these systems, we measure how much insect prey they eat. The more predators you have, the more insect prey they're eating. And this is probably why in our system for so many years, we didn't really have a lot of pest problems, because we had these tremendous numbers of predatory insects. They're really voracious. When we put out sentinel eggs, it's like in a matter of days, you put out these egg masses, and in a couple of days, they're just totally gone in these systems where you have a lot of predation. Okay, so I already talked.
There's a question in the chat, and maybe you'll get to this later, but it's a question I always get too, as well as Kyle apparently, that some farmers make the comment that certain soil pH, plant sugar levels, and other soil characteristics like calcium can increase plant defenses and limit the impact of harmful insects. That a specific soil pH is an example, has been shown to reduce harmful insects. What are your thoughts on our knowledge and research? What data has about those sorts of
yeah, I'm going to get to that actually.
Oh,
awesome. I have some
okay.
slides on that.
Okay, wonderful.
Right.
Okay.
If you can wait just a second. So these insect parasitic fungi, again, as I mentioned, they're really common in soil and they parasitize insects. So those insects are always there. The insect pests are always there, and you have these natural enemies keeping them to sort of non-nuisance levels a lot of time. If your soil health is really working. And the infectious, unlike Mycorrhizae, which grow through the soil, is that thread-like hyphae. A lot of these fungi, they exist in the soil as spores. Here you can see this is a insect, this big white ball here is a type of fungus called Bovaria. There's an infected insect in there, and these are the, it's growing those thread-like hyphae that are growing out of that dead insect and making spores. And some have even grown out into the soil and are making spores in the soil. So when these insect parasitic fungi infect insects, what you end up with is like where the insect used to be, now there's a big clump of spores. So it's very much just a clump, right? It's not spread throughout. So for organisms like that can't spread themselves through soil by like growing extensively through the soil, like hyphae, a little bit of disturbance actually spreads them around a little bit, and you find it's more likely that they'll come into contact with either plant roots that they can grow into, or with insects that may be moving, larger insects that may be moving through the soil. So a little bit of soil disturbance isn't bad for some of these organisms. It is detrimental for Mycorrhizae if you do a lot of extensive tillage. But for these organisms that are in their beneficial bacteria, fungi that exist in the soil as spores or individual cells, a little bit of disturbance can mix them up in the soil and distribute them from their like clumped distribution after they've infected an insect. Okay, the other type of disturbance, of course, in organic systems, this is much less of a problem than in conventional systems, are synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. And we know even in organic systems, when you have excessive nitrogen, when you have excessive nutrients in your soil, excessive fertility, that actually is not good for plants. In high plant tissue, nitrogen really decreases plant resistance in that natural immune system that plants have, and it increases their susceptibility to insect plants and plant disease. So you can have too much of a good thing, and you do not want to have excessive nitrogen levels, and it's bad for the environment. So there was a recent study that was reported last year, and this was in Europe. It wasn't in the United States, but I kind of suspect that it would be similar here. They screened 100 fields. 40 of those were organic and 60 were conventional. And they screened them for 46 pesticides or pesticide breakdown products. And they found pesticides or those breakdown products in all the fields, including the organic fields. Although the number of residues and the concentration was much higher in the conventional systems than in the organic systems. But unfortunately, even in fields that had been in organic for a long period of time, in some cases 20 years, they still found residues from these insecticides, although the number and the kind of pesticides decreased with time in organic. They found that where soil pHs were higher, the biodegradation of those pesticide residues was decreased. And it also decreased the mobility of those pesticide residues, so that if they were water soluble, I guess they did not solubilize as quickly where the soil pH was higher. And I don't know if that was microbial or just a function of the chemistry. And that mycorrhizal biomass and abundance of mycorrhizae were negatively linked to the number of pesticide residues in soil. And they concluded that pesticides in soil were likely a key driver of mycorrhizal abundance, and mycorrhizae, of course, are important in soil health and in plant health, which affects their susceptibility and attractiveness to insect pests. And so this is just, these are the residuals, but it shows the general pattern with number of pesticide residues at a site in the conventionally tilled conventional systems, the no-till conventional systems, in the organic. You can see the organic has higher numbers of mycorrhizal roots and microbial biomass than these conventional systems. But again, they were still negatively affected by pesticide residues. And here's the pH. What they found was most important for microbial. They measured a lot of different factors in the soil, and they found that microbial biomass and the amount of roots that were colonized by mycorrhizae, the most important factors, positive factor, was pH. Having a balanced pH was really important. And the red bar's negative effect, the number of pesticides, was the driver, the most important driver for microbial biomass, carbon or microbial biomass in mycorrhizal. So, you know, if you're just recently transitioning, one would hope that those pesticide residues from the past would gradually decrease, and so your soil health should increase with that. But the removal of pesticides from those systems should help you build soil health. However, I don't know, you might have some vegetable growers here that I know in field crops we don't use a lot of even allowable pesticides, but of course there are allowable pesticides in organic systems, and just because they're allowable and they're from a natural source does not necessarily mean they're harmless. And we know, for example, that most nitrogen fixing bacteria like Rhizobium, most copper-based fungicides are deleterious to those. For Mycorrhizae, is compatible with some of these allowed materials like spinosades, pyrethrum, and the plant oils, but neem is very inhibitory to mycorrhizae and can cause significant shifts in the populations of those mycorrhizal communities. And the fungus, one of the fungi, that insect pathogen, and it can be endophytic, that I work with, Metarhizium, compatible with spinosad, but all of those mycoparasite products that are usually sold as plant growth enhancers or to protect from plant disease, they are detrimental to Metarhizium, and I would assume probably some other fungi too, because these things are parasites of fungi. And so they would attack probably not just plant pathogenic fungi, but other kinds of fungi in the soil. And neem is toxic to these fungi too. So even in systems where you use these allowable materials, I think we need to be careful about how we use them judiciously, because they can have negative impacts on soil health. Manure, someone brought up manure in general. Overall, the broad pattern is that manure is actually beneficial for soil health and plant health, and for pest management, where we use manure for fertility. Plants have higher levels of those chemical defense compounds, and there tend to be greater numbers of insect predators. There are more alternate preys that they can survive on. There's usually greater microbial activity in soil, and your organic matter is higher, which also contributes to your soil biological health, as opposed to where you're using inorganic fertility, where you tend to have more plant feeding insects, less and lower chemical defenses in those plants, lower organic matter and lower microbial activity. Okay, am I running out of time? All right. And so that the third principle is to have a surface residue. And this is sort of a double-edged sword. It probably, you need to know your system and what you have in the environment, because it can provide a tremendous habitat for especially spiders and ground beetles. On the other side, if you have like a lot of problems with slugs, or insects, if you have a lot of, annually problems with the worms like black cutworm, you might want to not have a really heavy surface residue. You know, we have other benefits from surface residues, though. They can really control the fluctuation of soil moisture and temperature, which is actually good for soil health and for these predatory insects, can suppress weed growth. And it can provide, you know, it eventually becomes organic matter as it's decomposed in your soil. On the other hand, you know, you need, if you're going to use it for weed control, you need a lot of biomass. This says 3 tons per acre, but we find it's more like 6 or 8, depends on your weed pressure. Not effective for suppressing perennial weeds. If you have a really recalcitrant, high fiber residue, it can tie up nitrogen as the microbes in the soil compete for that nitrogen with your crop. And probably more of a concern, like in our area and your areas, it can really delay soil warm up in the spring. You probably need to use some row openers or row cleaners to allow soil to warm up so that you can get that seed to germinate and grow as quickly as possible. And if you have a really heavy, we found if you have a really heavy residue, it can be really challenging without really good equipment to get the planter to function properly in planting. This is just an example from a, this is potatoes, but it shows where surface mulch was applied. And then they looked at the number of predatory insects, in this case, ground beetles that they had. And what they found is where they applied straw mulch early, that's where this green line is, in 2 years, they had much higher numbers of beneficial predatory ground beetles in those systems than where they had applied it later or not at all. They did reduce the abundance of potato leafhopper and the plant damage from potato leafhopper where they had high residue amount or mulch. They did increase the abundance of Colorado potato beetle, but it reduced the amount of egg masses and larvae they had, and it's probably due to predation because they had increased predator abundance. And in, but even though they had those higher predator numbers, the potato yields were similar in mulched and unmulched plots. So even though they had a little bit higher pest pressure, it didn't result in greater damage. Okay, and this is from an apple orchard where they looked at microbial functional diversity. That's kind of the jobs that different organisms in the soil are doing. And what they found is where they had an organic surface residue, they had cornstalk mulch or ryegrass mulch, the microbial diversity was much greater than where they had no surface residue in a conventional tillage system, or where they had used a black ground fabric for mulch. So that organic mulching really increased their functional diversity, which is what you want. You want a lot of diversity of these microbes in the soil to contribute to soil health. Okay. And of course, a lot of surface residue, if you can manage this system, can be very weed suppressive. We also find that these beneficial fungi, in this case, the one I'm working with, this Mycorrhiza, which is that insect pathogenic endophytic fungus, needs some soil moisture, and where we have good soil moisture and characteristics that are related to soil moisture, we have higher abundance or higher prevalence of that organism. There's a negative relationship with sand. Okay, and the final principle is to maximize biodiversity, and I think that's a message that everybody commonly gets, because biodiversity supports pest regulation through promotion of those predatory and insect pathogenic organisms, and it does a lot of other things too. It increases pollination, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and it increases the likelihood, when you have high diversity, it increases the likelihood that something you want to be there will be there. And so the way we can manage for that biodiversity, we know that continuous monocultures are susceptible to pests and damage, and that diversifying crop rotations can break up pest cycles and provide more resources for natural enemies and beneficial organisms. We can have diversity in space, which are things like, you know, underseeding and insectary strips or intercropping, planting diverse crop species and varieties. And of course, we can have diversity in time, which is required in organic systems. We need to have a good crop rotation as opposed to continuous cropping of one type. You can have incorporate cover crops and double cropping. And so really for pest management, we want to focus on building soil health to enhance the soil function, which includes pest suppression. And so to promote natural pest control and to also support those natural plant defense mechanisms by supporting beneficial microbes that can help turn on or prime those defense systems and deter pests. And then we want to really, if we're in systems where you have materials that are economical to use, we want to use those only if our yield goals are not, or quality goals are not being met. And so this is where I started. So that is what I have prepared. I know we had a little bit of discussion on fall armyworm at the beginning. So did someone mention seed corn maggot earlier?
I mentioned seed corn maggot
You
for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, we got hit by we used to have a monitoring program for Western bean cutworm because, you know, in about 2000, it started moving from the Great Plains. It started moving eastward. And so we started a monitoring program and we never had a problem with it until this year. And we had ceased that monitoring program. But what's really bad about Western bean cutworm is that it's not cannibalistic. So you can have several insects per ear. It likes to bore into the ear, and it really increases the susceptibility to these molds and mycotoxins. So this is a pest that's very worrisome. And that's another one you can monitor for, and you can go to those websites and monitor for. It's really hard to catch when they're early. It's easier to know when the adults are flying because otherwise you need to monitor for the egg masses. And there's really not a lot you can do except in a high value crop. I mean, in a field crop, there probably isn't a lot you can do. There's strong flyers. There are materials registered for them for in higher value use in higher value crops, like, but mostly it's, you would, if you needed to monitor for this pest, it would be through those insect monitoring sites. Yeah, the seed corn maggot, we have had some of the problems with that. Again, that's sort of the flies are, the first generation flies emerge in your field or near your fields, and they're looking for nice decomposing places with nice decomposing organic matter to lay their eggs in the soil. And so when you plant your seed into that, when it germinates, that's very attractive and a good resource for the larvae that like to feed on those germinating seeds. And it's really a problem in cool, wet springs where you have heavy textured or wet soils, high organic matter levels, and where you've tilled either manure or green manures into the soil so that it's decomposing. So yeah, your recommendation of waiting is good. This is just the life cycle. We all know, you know, the flies lay eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae that attack those germinating seeds, and then they eventually pupate. But that's all been modeled, so we know how many growing degree days on average that takes. There is no rescue treatment, but they do have a lot of natural enemies. And again, avoiding planting into wet soil, reduce tillage. When we trap for these flies emerging in our tilled and our reduced tillage systems, organic systems. We hardly have any of these flies emerging out of the no-till or the reduced tillage systems, but we have we can trap flies emerging out of the tilled soil.
Michael O'Donnell had a question about stink bugs in soybeans.
Oh,
we talked about that before, and I don't know if we saw that in Wisconsin, but he said that was pretty prevalent in Indiana this year.
Yeah, we have not had really that big of a problem with stink bug. I know brown marmorated stink bug has been an invasive pest, has some natural enemies, but in terms of, yeah.
I can speak up to our experience.
Good. Speak from experience, please.
Okay. So I work with an operation in Northwest Indiana, about halfway between Indianapolis and Chicago. All acres are organic or transition. And we had, it was more the stink bugs resulted in sort of secondary pathogen issues. So I did speak with Christian Krupke at Purdue about what we experienced. And I think that's kind of what cued us in on the stink bug issue, and that there were problems more widely in that part of at least in that region. But we had a number of fields that resulted in varying amounts of kind of shriveled, colored, and rotten soybeans. And Christian basically explained that because we had submitted samples to the lab, and at first the field crop pathologist looked at it and she passed it off. And so I spoke with Christian. He said, yeah, stink bugs, with their piercing,
piercing,
mouthpiece
sucking,
introducing yeast and molds and things that could persist and cause problems. And his explanation was that they're just generally in the population, and it's not necessarily the brown marmorated, but probably just the regular
there's a
green
stink bug, and
that they're attracted to anything that's essentially senescing and ripening. And so if we have like a soybean field that's like starting that process early or late relative to other soybeans in the area or something, that can attract a larger population, result in potential damage relative to fields where they may have been ripening or senescing at the same time more broadly with soybean production in the area. And that might explain why we had some fields that had quite a bit of damage, and then others that had zero damage. And that he encouraged us to kind of relook at planting dates and harvest dates and maturity and things like that, to think about sort of this ripening or senescing sequencing relative to everybody else in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a great point. And he is a great source of information, Christian Krupke. I a lot of the stuff that I report, I get from his materials, which brings up another point. Your extension, even if it's not specifically aimed at organic growers, there's a lot of the basic in those extension publications, which are often free to download from extension websites at universities like Purdue or Wisconsin or Minnesota. Those are free to download, and they have a lot of information about the biology of these pests. And you bring up planting date and sort of relay movement of pests between different maturity groups and planting. I think that's really important, because there are some pests, and depending on what you have in your environment, some pests benefit from like early planting. The pressure might be worse if you had planted early, and some are worse if you had planted late. And so it's kind of good. I mean, it is good if you have had issues with particular pests, to either talk to your extension educator, like Christian, or to look at some of this published these publications, these extension publications, or watch for the bulletins, even though they're not targeted at organic growers. I mean, there's very little out there. You're lucky to have Aaron, that really focus on organic growers. And of course, that's a wonderful resource, but there's still information to be gleaned from that information produced for conventional growers, especially around planting date and when pest pressures, like this whole modeling of seed corn maggot. I mean, that's all developed for conventional systems, but we can still take advantage of those monitoring sites and pest reports and surveys, and you know, these growing degree day models that kind of here last year. This was for Pennsylvania, where we were, you know, if the flies were emerging in April because they had amassed enough growing degree days, and it wasn't in the fly free period wasn't until the end of May. And so if you had planted any time between those times, it would be, and you had a population of seed corn maggot, it would be likely that you would suffer damage if you had the conditions of, you know, cool, wet spring and tilled organic matter, and then you planted into that. There's a probability that that you would have pressure from seed corn maggot, especially if you monitored them with either yellow sticky cards or a yellow bowl trap like that and saw that you had flies.
There's another question in the chat specifically about applying sugar or molasses to increase plant bricks to make the plants less effective to attractive insect invasions. There was a conventional co-op using molasses to treat alfalfa weevil this spring, saying that the insects engorge themselves on the sugars and die. Is that more related to the molasses or bricks or neither? It just,
I know, you know, I know nothing about molasses using that. There are baits that incorporate molasses in conventional system. You know, they have baits that have insecticides plus those things, and in grits and some kind of carrier to attract the pest to eat the insecticide. But and that there are also baits like that to attract beneficial organisms, because a lot of these, like parasitoids and some predatory insects, they also need sugars to survive. They want other things in their diet besides other insects or insect food, you know. But in terms of the bricks issue, that one, I know there's a lot of talk about having high bricks, and but I have not read anything in the scientific literature about that. Not that there isn't anything valid by people's observations or experience. And if someone has experience with that and has realized a benefit, please speak up and tell us what you know, because I'd be interested in hearing that too. Has anybody used that? I know in some compost teas, you know, you have a carbon source like that too. It's a little scary to me, actually. But
definitely one of the many areas that we need more.
I know. We definitely need, well, and we need funding too.
Yeah. Oh, you can't retire yet, Mary. There's way too many
you need
open
you know, a lot of these things, you know, even if you proposed to do the research on them, a lot of them are just so unknown. And so, you know, in science, we like to control all the variables, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, because we like it to be reproducible, what we find. But some of these practices are just so variable. And so scientists don't like to, when they review your proposals, they don't like to fund them because they think, how are you going to control the variability of, you know, this formulation or that formulation? It's going to be different every time you know, use it or test it. So yeah, that's an interesting area. I have just conversationally heard a lot of bricks talk, but I know nothing about that. Erin, do you know anything about that?
I don't. I think these ecological systems where it's just hard to control, and just because we don't have the data obviously doesn't mean that there's not something out there. But
Right. No, absolutely.
I also get cautious when there's sometimes overstatements of products because there isn't the data necessarily. It's to confirm that it works. So it's a tough situation for farmers to be in because there isn't necessarily a lot of guidance. So I see kind of both sides of the coin, that definitely a little bit of a buyer beware when trying some of these products that don't have data. But again, just because there's not data, it doesn't mean that there isn't something to it. So I always advise people to start small and be observant and have control plots so that you can see how it works on your farm.
No, that's exactly what I recommend too, is like, yeah, don't buy it for the whole farm. Just like give it a test. And then, there's can also be variability between years because biological systems are so affected by things like weather and when the moisture comes, how much moisture, how warm. So it's really challenging. So I admire farmers who can deal with all that variability. It's kind of amazing that we can grow the crops we do sometimes, I feel like, with all the unpredictability in some of these systems.
We are just about at time. Thank you so much, Mary, for joining us and presenting a whole wealth of information on a variety of topics, including more detailed insect management and the bigger picture of how the soil, which is such a foundation of organic, impacts our ability to manage insects and those dynamics. So I will post the recording on the website. If there's any follow-up that anyone needs, don't hesitate to email me, and we'll see you all again in a couple weeks. So thank you again, Mary.
Okay, thank you. Bye.